Today, we're going to be talking about spouses retiring at different times. So, a couple is looking to retire, one will retire sooner than the other. And what does that do to spending? And what are some of the big reasons why someone would retire at different times? I'll call it staggering. We're going to talk about that today. Let me bring in my co host, Tony Shore. Tony, welcome to the show. So, we're going to talk about a couple retiring and retiring at different times. What do you think?
Well, I think it's good. Everybody has a different time horizon and time frame and goals, right? So it's going to vary, but obviously, age has a big role in this.
Yeah.
My wife and I don't know if we're going to retire the same year. That's for sure. Is that what you're talking about? Like
Yeah,
one
and
retiring
what
earlier?
and what the implications of it, because there's obviously there's a lot of reasons, right? Age is a big factor, but I think a lot of people, some people work for health insurance. I have a problem with that,
I was going to
but
bring up health insurance
yeah,
is a big one.
and social impact. People identify with work, they become work, and then when they leave, they get bored. I have a lot of couples that retire, and then one of them goes back to work because they're not compatible with each other, even though they're married. That
Sure.
that private time at home is infringed upon, and
Well, yeah, my
but
dad, I have to tell
yeah,
right there, my mom and dad at their 50th wedding anniversary. I think I've told this story before, real quick. They're up there. People are like, Ruth, how did you do it? 50 years of marriage. That's great. He was gone a lot. How'd you make it 50 years? They asked my mom. He was gone a lot.
he
So,
didn't.
uh, so when all of a sudden, if you both retire, especially if one of the spouses is a stay-at-home, either they work from home or they're a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, and then the other is always at work but then retires and they're always
Yeah,
around.
yeah,
So that can cause contention, can it?
it certainly can. And but I found this study and some data on the financial impacts, and there's a big relationship to spending and
Hmm.
staggered retirement. So, for those that are watching, you can see, I'll put the link up. This is called the Three New Spending Surprises Additional Insights into Retirement Spending Behaviors, JP Morgan Asset Management. So they've done this before, and I'm going to go through the basic three ideas of spending in retirement, how that works, but what the new finding is um, about people that retire at different times. So, according to them, I think it's 53%. So, more than half of households do not retire all at once.
Right.
And it's usually one spouse retiring earlier than the other and one still working and earning. And they call that a partial household. So, I'll use the definition so that we know we're talking about a partially retired household is a household that continues to receive some income while still also drawing 20% of their household income from Social Security, pensions, or annuities. So it's not one person retiring and the other person not working and they're not touching retirement. That's not considered partial retirement. It is one person still working and the other pulling from, or both of them pulling from some retirement savings.
Rather
That's
than
the
one person retires, but they don't touch their retirement savings,
right,
they just live off the other person's salary. That's not
right.
partially retired.
That's not partially retired according to that definition.
Sure.
Okay. So let me just go through the three um, issues that they brought up over the years that JP Morgan Asset Management has found about spending. And then I want to ask you a question about what you think, and I'll ask you to relate it to you and your wife. So
Sure.
there's a spending curve, and what they found is that spending doesn't remain constant. We knew that, but it peaks at midlife. And then as you get older, your spending declines, which is counter to a lot of conventional wisdom, which is your spending goes up as you get older. Um, what happens is spending declines, and but it's just what you spend it on changes. So you spend more on healthcare as you get older, and less on going out and dancing, right? Unfortunately, so I use the spending smile. So
Mhm.
you're
Yep.
spending early on in retirement, and then it goes down, and then it back up, right?
Right.
That's not new. We don't that we know.
That's
Then
pretty
there's
typical.
something that right, totally. But a lot of people think it's just constant spending going
Mm.
up, and that's not how it works.
No.
Um, and a lot of people think they'll spend less when they first retire, and I think it's the complete opposite. You spend more early, and
Of
that's what
course.
this is, a spending surge. On average, post-retirement spending temporarily increases for partially retired households with pre-retirement income of less than 150,000. So people that are making less than 150,000 as a family before they retire, right after they retire, there's a
Surge.
spending surge,
Yeah.
right? And then finally, they said there's some volatility. So retirement spending varies from year to year, and it's not stable and predictable for a majority of people. So one thing I want to point out, though, that is very common. People think when they retire, their spending is just going to go up, and inflation's going to be a big factor. But what they found in this study is that for people that have between 250 and 750,000 of assets for retirement, the annualized inflation adjusted change in spending is only 1.65%. And and this is for all households. So except, this is for all houses, partial or full retired households that have that asset. And typically people think, okay, inflation is 2.5, closer to 3%. So I at least am going to be having to spend that much. And what they found is no, people are spending less than general inflation. Um, and that surprises people. They think, well, inflation on healthcare alone is going to bump me, but it just doesn't seem that way. People aren't spending as much as they get older. I think people slow down. Now, in the early part, they spend, but you know, um, it's it's overblown, the spending. So
Hmm.
when I'm running numbers on people, a lot of people just don't know what they spend. I try and explain this, that spending's going to go down, but we do a couple of things differently for early retirement. So those were the big three: spending volatility, spending surge, and spending curve. So I'm going to ask you, Tony, if you think about your situation, if you and your wife retire simultaneously, are you guys similar age?
We are.
Similar age?
Or
Okay.
we are. Yeah. She's a
So,
couple of years younger.
okay. So that kind of works. It's not egregious, 20 years difference.
It's
Um,
three,
you know,
actually. 3 years.
right.
Yeah.
3 years. Okay. So, I mean, but that's still right. So let's say you're 65, she's 62. That you could see that. But if you're 60 and she's 57, you might be like, that's not fair. Right. So, um, if you guys retire at the same time versus retiring, one stays on and the other works, probably going to be you staying on because you think you're going to work forever. But which in those scenarios do you think you'll spend more in retirement? Which of those scenarios would you spend more? One continues to work and the other retires later, or both retire at the same time?
I would say both retiring at the same time. If my wife and I both retired at the same time, we would spend more because we would want to do activities together rather than me just, especially it depends on which one, it's versus which one retires first. If I retire first, who knows what I'm going to do? Lounge about, not be productive, not travel without my spouse because she'll be working. So I think we would definitely spend more if we retired together. And I want to point out, it's the cliche you always hear, especially from financial planners, which goes with the show perfectly, is what day of the week do you spend the most money? Saturday, right? Most people right now during their working years, you and I, average working
Yeah,
age or in our 50s, 60s, whatever, if we're working, we spend the most money. I spend more money on Saturdays than I do any day of the week. And the internet has changed this some, or online shopping, but basically on the weekends, my wife and I spend way more money than we do during the week. We're not eating out as much during the week, things like that. And in retirement, every day is a Saturday.
true.
There's
True.
6 Saturdays and a Sunday, they say, right?
Right. And what you've said makes sense to me and to most people, but the data says the opposite.
Oh, really?
So, yes. So
Really?
partially retired. Remember, this is one working,
Yeah.
and the other one, they're still taking some retirement funds,
Hmm.
but one is still working. They spend more preceding retirement, they save less, they have more debt, and they continue to spend more in retirement than their fully retired peers.
Really?
Yes.
Because I thought if my wife and I retire and we still have our health when we first retire, we have a bucket list we want to knock off, and that's
Yeah.
expensive.
You,
And we're not going to be doing those things if one of us is working still, I think. That's
and
my
there's a couple of
justification.
I understand that. I agree with you, but I think there's a couple things that are causing the partially retired to spend more. So,
Okay.
more from the data, there's a distinct subset of households that are within that cohort, the partially retired. They're likely to experience a spending surge at retirement. So, the partially retired have a spending surge when they retire, which is interesting. So one retires and now all of a sudden they're spending a whole lot more. And overall, 6 in 10 households experience some sort of volatility in the first few years. So the question is why? Why would a partially retired, one continue to work, have a more of a spending? And my gut tells me that, and I'm going to get to what their logic is, but my gut would say if I am working and my wife is retired, she and I will both feel, well, I still got my salary, so we can spend more because I got that money coming in. And
The
it gives kind of
mindset.
like a
It's not
mindset
fixed
that
budget. You're not on a fixed budget.
correct. And
There
yet,
you go.
if we're both retired, then it's like we're both on the same page, like, oh, wait, all right. Neither of us are working, neither of us are bringing money in. So we know what we have. We're on that budget.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Or in my case, if I retired first and my wife was still working, I'd be in record stores and pizza shops just throwing money around like it's, going
Right,
out
and
of
she's still
style.
working. You're like, you're cracking the whip. Keep working. Like, daddy's got to buy a new LP. So, so the logic they have in there too that they mentioned in the study was that the reason why people are partially retiring is because they can't afford to fully retire. So they would both like to retire, but they can't because they don't have enough money. So they're already they're back against the wall. So they're going to be spending more anyway. So partially retiring, they now don't even have enough to live. So
Sure.
um so the lower income people are going to have spending surges and they're going to run into spending more in retirement than those that are already, because if you think about it, if a
Makes
couple
sense.
retires and they have enough money, they're not too worried about overspending because their budget is much higher. Um, Another issue, and I'm dealing with this, I've dealt with this recently, is you might not have the option to turn your pension on if you have it when you want. So you might have an employer that says, well, if you retire at 60, you have to turn your pension on then, or we're not going to pay out your sick time, or we're not going to,
Right.
you have, and you get a steep discount. So, well, I want to wait until I'm older. Well, we don't allow that. So there might be some limits as to when you can turn on your income,
Yeah.
and
Well,
or
yeah,
it's, oh, you
most
have to wait till
employers or the
65.
government require if you retire, your pension kicks in, right? I mean,
Right,
that's
and
yeah.
so you don't have as much control. It's not
No.
ideally, it doesn't fit your retirement income plan, but you have no choice based on the rules. And then the last issue I wanna bring up is the Social Security timing and rules. So, you might say, "All right, well, we wanna turn on Social Security on my spouse, but I want mine to continue to roll up," and we just did the show on that. You can't get a spousal benefit if you don't file, if your spouse doesn't open the window, if you're currently married. So there's some rules that don't allow for Social Security to start when you might want it to start.
Hmm.
And so there's limitations there
Right.
that might lead to those that stagger retirement spending more. But I'm going with the whole mindset as the main reason
Yeah,
is
that
that,
makes
hey,
sense,
we
and that
have to,
makes sense. That does make sense. Yeah.
yeah. So what do you do? All right. You might have a spouse like Tony, you might like working and don't mind, but your wife might be sick of it. And
Right.
like, I can't do this anymore. It's gonna,
Right.
and then life's too short to be working in an environment where you can't live. It's not, you're killing yourself just by
Right.
working.
Right.
So what do you do? Well, it doesn't mean you can't partially retire or do the staggered retirement. You just got to think about a few things. So the first thing you got to think about is you got to plan for income. So when you're thinking about retiring, it's like, all right, we're just going to turn on pension or Social Security. But no, you have to go deeper and say, where's the money going to come from in each year? How is this going to look? What's our budget? What's our retirement income budget? What's the plan? And most importantly, you have to factor in the early surges. If you're going to retire, you might want to do that trip that you've always talked about. You might say, I'm buying a new car, so I don't have to think about my car in retirement. You have to think about those early surges of spending and separate that from your budget and put it in its own category. Because if you don't plan for that, you might get hit with an early surge in spending, and then you're hit with potential sequence of return risk. So you have your money in the market goes down, and then you retire, and then you start taking money out and you're selling at the bottom. I'll give you a quick story. I had a client, have a client. She worked her whole life for United Healthcare.
Mm.
And when we first met, a ton of her money was in the company stock, and she was employed by them. So everything was riding on them, and it was working great for her. But I said to her years ago, I said, if you retire and we don't divest your stock away from your corporate stock, what if the company does something silly? What if the CEO does something crazy and the stock drops to no fault of your own? It's a good company, but you never know. Let's divest that. Let's get your income that you're going to use for the first few years of retirement out, set aside, just to protect against craziness. And sure enough, United Healthcare, I think in 2025, they're down 57% of the stock is. Who would have thought? So if she had retired this year too. So if she retired in 2025 and had still had everything there, all of a sudden half the portfolio is gone.
Mm.
That changes life tremendously. So
Oh, yeah.
you have to plan for the early spending. And now that's
Sure.
an example of an investment going south. What if it's just we want to buy an RV, or we want to do the trips, or we want to go on vacation? Whatever. You have to plan for that.
Yeah, and
Um,
having a plan is the key. In other words, maybe having not everything in the market, but having some money in some principal protected options, or if you're in the
right,
want to be in the market, a buffered index portfolio where you have downside protection. For
right,
some of the money for your spouse who is going to retire earlier, there's some money there that you've already planned this out, and it's not subject to market risk, right? If
right.
you
It
have
could
a
be in the
down
bank.
year like 2022, and that's when your spouse wants to retire, only one of you is working, and the spouse starts pulling money out of the market, yeah, you're going to
Right,
miss. You're not taking advantage of the sequence of returns, and you're pulling money out when maybe the market's down. That's not good.
right,
So if you're going to need income from your savings, then it has to be somewhere else or protected somehow, right?
right, right. And I would go 3, 4 years, 5 years out and say, all right, where's our money going to be that we need in 3 years?
Yeah.
And that's the bucket strategy. We did a show on that,
Yeah.
having those buckets.
I like that
And
strategy.
and the other thing to think about, the plan for, is the Social Security timing, delaying it. Just
Mm,
because you retired doesn't mean you have to take Social Security. People conflate the two.
they do.
Retiring from your job doesn't mean you have to turn on Social Security. You could delay Social Security, yet still retire. But how are you going to fill that income gap? Because you need to have income to live. So having a very strong Social Security plan is critical part of the overall retirement income
It's the
plan.
foundation.
And so, right. And so when you're thinking, all right, we're both going to delay Social Security, is that really going to work if you have a spending surge? If you're, 61 years old and retired, and we're not going to turn Social Security on for another 5 years, 6 years. Well, what if you have a huge spending surge? Where's the money going to come from? Did you factor that in? I like being strategic with Social Security, but you also have to intertwine it with your income from other sources. You can't have them in silo. You have to make sure that they're working together.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
it's surprising that the split households in terms of retirement, the staggered retirement, actually causes people to spend more money. I think it's because it's a lower income people that are staggering because they have no choice. But then again, it's important to know spending isn't straight line. Fluctuations happen. Surges are a big factor. And for a lot of my clients, they don't want to have a surge because they're afraid they're going to run out of money. And I'm trying to convince them, no, let's do it. Let's build in that spending surge the first 3 years of retirement. Let's spend more than you think you're going to want to. And I'll show you the math that you're not going to run out of money if we do other things, because a lot of people want to spend money early because they get the idea of the go-go years,
Yeah.
but they're afraid. So this plan covers the fear of running out, but also helps you not run out. If you don't have a plan, you might do nothing or do the wrong thing. And I think that's wrong in both cases.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned go-go, because retirement consists of, it's the standard. You've got your go-go years right at the beginning, and that's when you still have your health, you're able to travel, you're able to do things, camp, whatever you're doing. And so you start up with the spending, but then you hit your slow go years, and the spending's going to decrease dramatically for most people during their slow go years, because you no longer have the drive or the energy or the ability, and your health starts to go. And then the no-go years, then you're going to need more money for healthcare even then. So it's got the smile effect. But when you should plan to spend more money right away. That way you can actually enjoy your retirement, in my opinion.
Yeah. And if you don't plan, you either will spend too much and you'll run into trouble, or you'll spend too little, which I call underspending. And people say, well, I'm not spending too little.
You'll be hoarding for no reason.
Yes. And then you'll potentially have regrets of, man,
well, what did you work so hard on?
Right.
If you work so hard for retirement, why not enjoy it? I see people do this. I've seen people, we've talked about this, Dan. I've had people in my life where I look and they're retired. They're almost 90 years old, and they've barely touched that retirement savings, and they're living like paupers. And they're like, I don't know if I have enough money to make it. You're 89 years old. You've got enough money.
Yeah, right. And so do they, but certain people are just going to be that way, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you have to,
yeah.
but wouldn't it be better to plan for a surge early and then just not do it than not do it because you're afraid you won't have enough?
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So plan for it.
Plan for it. Yeah, that's the message, Tony. So again, you were wrong. You guessed wrong, and I knew that going in.
I didn't guess anything.
You said that if you both retire at the same time, you're going to spend more.
For us, it may be true.
Yeah, I think it is. I think you're going to spend more no matter what. I think
that's true.
Your wife. I think the best strategy is for your wife to keep you working to stop you from spending.
Yes.
With your free, not like you don't have a lot of free time as it is with what you do.
Oh, come on. I do. Dan, wow,
I picked on you, Tony. I love you.
Harsh.
Thanks for a good show. I'll see you next week.
All matters discussed in today's show are for informational purposes only.
This show is not investment advice.
Dan Riddle nor Dolphin Financial Group are affiliated or endorsed by any government agency.
Investment advisory services are offered through Dolphin Wealth Management, Inc., a registered investment advisor in the state of Florida.
Insurance products and services are offered through Dolphin Insurance, Inc.
Dolphin Wealth Management Inc. and Dolphin Insurance Inc. are affiliated companies doing businesses as Dolphin Financial Group.
You should talk to someone at Dolphin Financial Group before implementing any of these strategies or ideas.